There is a silence more profound than absence, and it lives beneath every heartbeat. It is not the silence of peace, but of knowledge, dark, inescapable, and old as time itself. Before the child cries its first breath into the indifferent air, this silence knows the futility of the sound. Before the sun casts its warm illusion upon skin and eye, this silence understands that light, too, is a trick of the senses, a fleeting performance upon the stage of nothingness. The world, adorned in appearances, seduces the mind into movement. The trees whisper of growth, the cities echo with purpose, the faces speak of love and ambition. But beneath it all lies the great wound, existence. To be born is to be condemned to hunger, not for food, but for meaning, which the world never offers in any lasting form. Every joy is a deception, a momentary dulling of the blade that carves the self from the shapeless void. And we pursue this dulling like a man chasing a mirage across a desert, knowing, somewhere in his marrow, that water will never be found. The will blind, insatiable, and ceaseless drives all things, not by reason, not by design, but by a trembling impulse that never asks if the destination is real. You do not choose to desire. Desire chooses you. It clutches the soul in its cold hands and whispers false promises of fulfillment. If only, it says, if only you had more, looked better, rose higher, found someone. But each time the object is reached, the hunger remains. The will does not rest, it shifts, mutates, finds new masks. It is the disease that disguises itself as cure. Modern man, wrapped in the garments of technology and progress, imagines himself free. He speaks of agency, of building a better world, of creating meaning in the void. But this is merely the will donning new robes. The old hunger now parades through screens and systems, algorithms and aspirations. We no longer kneel before gods, but we prostrate ourselves before metrics, followers, ideals. And still the gnawing persists. Still the quiet hours return like ghosts after midnight, asking the same question with dreadful calm. Why? This is not a question the world can answer, for it is the very question that reveals the lie. Meaning is not found, it is fabricated, patched together like rags over an open wound. Culture weaves these rags from myth, market, and memory. It tells us to love, to achieve, to hope. But these are only lullabies sung to a child who is already dying. The pain does not vanish. It only learns to wear a smile. Do you not feel it? In the moments of solitude, in the pauses between distractions, in the heavy stillness after a fleeting pleasure has passed. That awareness, quiet and sharp like a blade dipped in moonlight, that nothing truly satisfies, and that the very act of wanting is itself the source of torment. This is the heart of things. Not the love songs or victories, but the terrible recurrence of lack. Existence, as it reveals itself, is not a gift, but a compulsion, a sentence passed without trial, whose terms are etched into the sinews of being. And yet, in this realization, there is a strange form of clarity. The moment one stops running, the moment one ceases to believe in the promised land of eventual happiness, something shifts. The weight does not vanish, but it becomes visible. And when suffering is seen, truly seen, not as a misfortune, but as the fundamental law of the world, one begins to awaken, not into joy, but into lucidity. This lucidity is not welcomed by the world. It frightens those who still cling to hope, as if hope were a raft upon the ocean of despair. But hope is not a raft. It is the illusion that the water is not real. To lose hope, then, is not to drown, but to finally feel the cold salt of the sea against your skin, and to know that you have always been floating in its depths. There is no shore. There never was. Even love, which the poets and saints have sung into the firmament, fails this truth. For love, too, is born of lack reaching toward another in hope of completion. But what is this completion but the will's cunning disguise? The beloved is not a savior, but a mirror, reflecting our hunger back at us with borrowed beauty. And so love, when held too tightly, rots into need, possession, fear. The flower fades and the scent becomes memory, and the will, unsatisfied still, moves on. To see this, and yet to continue not from faith, not from promise, but from awareness, this is the beginning of detachment. Not the detachment of indifference, but of sober seeing. The sage does not turn from the world because he despises it, but because he sees through it. He has touched its core and found only repetition, birth, hunger, striving, fading, death. Over and over, the same motion beneath different masks. Civilizations rise and fall like waves. Loves bloom and wither like ghostly petals in frost. All things move, and all movement is the will restless, unsatisfied, eternal. This movement never asks permission. The child is not consulted before it is thrown into the furnace of life. The animal does not question its slaughter. The old man, eyes dim with age, cannot will youth to return. And we, proud creatures that we are, imagine ourselves sovereign, but we are merely the dream of a force we cannot see, a force that does not think or plan, but only wants. We are its puppets, animated by absence, performing a play without script or audience. And so the question returns not as a demand, but as a whisper in the corridors of the mind. Is there any point? Maybe not, and that might be the door. For if there is no point, then the game ends. The masks drop, the noise stills, and in that stillness, something breathes a presence that does not crave, a silence that does not wound, not meaning, but freedom from meaning, not purpose, but peace in purposelessness. Suffering is not an error, not a flaw in the system to be corrected by progress or prayer. It is the very texture of existence. Like the air we breathe and cannot see, it surrounds every motion of the will. The creature moves because it lacks, and it lacks because it exists. Hunger is not the exception, it is the essence. Every moment of satisfaction is but a brief cessation of pain, a pause between aches, and in this brief pause, we are fooled into believing that joy is the real condition, and suffering merely the interruption. But the truth, once seen, turns the world upside down. Pleasure is the interruption, pain is the rule, and the mind, born to serve the will, creates illusions to survive this realization. It paints futures bathed in light, imagines destinies fulfilled, dreams of a self at peace. But this self, this imagined tranquility, is a shadow cast on the wall of the cave. It cannot be touched, and yet we crawl toward it, bleeding, crawling not because it is real, but because the will has no other motion but forward. Even despair does not halt it, it simply changes its disguise. The despairing man still desires. He desires to be free of desire. He still hopes, in his agony, for an end to agony. Thus the cycle turns. The illusions are sacred to the world. Society is built upon them. They are the currency of hope, the foundation of law, the mask of order. We are told to strive for love, for wealth, for enlightenment. But no one tells the child, as they hand him dreams, that all striving leads to the same wall. That what is attained becomes tasteless. That what is cherished fades. That even in triumph, the void watches silently from the corner of the room. The happiest face still decays, still weeps in secret, still fears the inevitable. For the will cannot be tamed, it can only be unmasked. And in that unmasking, pain becomes not an enemy, but a teacher. Not a test, but a revelation. It shows us what is real by stripping away what is false. In illness, in grief, in betrayal, in loneliness, something is revealed that success cannot teach. We see, in those moments, the naked shape of existence, cold, uninvited, relentless. No philosophy can make this truth comfortable. It is the wound that refuses healing, not because healing is impossible, but because the wound is the essence. To look upon this with open eyes is not to fall into despair, but to step beyond it. Despair still believes in hope, it is its bitter twin. But beyond both lies detachment, a stillness not born of denial, but of seeing without flinching. To detach is not to escape, but to stop pretending, to stop begging the world for what it cannot give. The detachment of the wise is not a numbness, but a profound clarity. They feel the sorrow of all things, but are no longer chained by it. They see the world as it is, not to judge it, not to fix it, but to be free from the lie. Freedom, then, is not found in choice, but in cessation. Not in the assertion of the self, but in its dissolution. The self is the stage upon which suffering plays out. The self is the one that wants, that fears, that remembers and anticipates. To dissolve this self, not into oblivion, but into awareness, is the only escape from the endless turning of the wheel. And this escape is not dramatic. It is quiet, like the falling of snow upon graves. It does not announce itself, it simply ceases to demand. The world continues, of course. The sun rises over battlefields. Children laugh before learning. Lovers cling before parting. Life performs its ancient rituals, and the will dances in every motion. But for the one who has seen, who has truly seen, there is a space between moments, a hollow untouched by desire. In that hollow, there is no why, no what next, no if only. There is only the unfolding of what is and the absence of resistance to its form. Even death, feared by all as the great theft, loses its terror here. For death is not the opposite of life, but its silent companion. It is the return to what was always true, that the self was never stable, never whole, never permanent. The death of the body is the final proof of the illusion of identity. And yet, this too is no tragedy. For what dies was never truly separate. It was always a flicker in the current, a brief name carved into flowing water. To suffer is to exist. To exist is to will, and to will is to lack. This is the law no God can overturn, no technology can circumvent. The structure is absolute. And yet, within this structure, the human mind is granted one quiet miracle: the ability to see clearly, even if only for a moment, the machinery of pain, the theater of illusion, the emptiness of striving. To see, and in seeing, to cease clutching at shadows. This clarity does not make life easier. It removes the comfort of lies, the narcotic of hope. It strips the soul bare. But in its nakedness, something emerges, not strength, not purpose, but silence. A silence not imposed, but chosen. And in that silence, the will no longer commands. It flickers, perhaps, in habit or echo, but it no longer reigns. The tyranny ends, not through revolution, but through disinterest. To be disinterested is not to be cruel. It is to love without clinging, to act without seeking reward, to witness without naming. The disinterested eye sees the rose and does not need it to last. It sees the suffering of another and does not flee nor attempt to fix what cannot be fixed. It simply remains, present without illusion. This is the eye of compassion, not the pity of superiority, but the shared knowing of futility. And so we walk, not toward meaning, but toward seeing. Not toward salvation, but toward surrender. The world cannot be saved, for it is not broken. It is, as it must be, a repetition of hunger and fading. And we, brief flickers within it, can only choose whether to sleep in the dream or to wake into the night. The further one peers into the heart of things, the more one realizes that consolation is not to be found in resolution, but in resignation. The world resists being fixed, not because it is complex, but because its very essence is to lack completion. Every system collapses, every ideal decays, every joy leaves behind the trace of its opposite. And yet we continue, like moths circling a flame that will not warm us, only consume. The human soul, if it can be said to exist apart from the machinery of the will, is not a flame of inspiration, but a mirror of despair. It reflects the world without adornment. It does not invent paradise, it reveals the prison. It is a slow witness, not to glory, but to entropy. To live is to decay in time, not only the body, but the thoughts, the loves, the meanings. Everything that begins carries within it the seed of its own dissolution. Even memory, which we cling to like a child to its fading mother, becomes corrupted, blurred by longing, twisted by need. And so the self becomes a palimpsest, overwritten with each moment's desire, each wound's echo, until what remains is not a core, but a residue. A person is not a being, but a persistence of suffering under a mask of continuity. We name ourselves, build identities, construct histories, but all of it is ash beneath the weight of time. The will does not preserve, it devours. To awaken to this is to step outside of the herd, to feel the wind of solitude blowing over the bones of civilization. What others cherish begins to appear trivial titles, rituals, pleasures, fears. One no longer participates, not out of disdain, but because the drama has become transparent. One sees the puppets pulled by invisible threads and the futility of shouting at the stage. The sage does not laugh, does not mock, he simply watches. And in his eyes, there is the stillness of one who has stepped out of time. Yet the heart resists this stillness. It aches for warmth, for meaning, for something to hold. Even after clarity dawns, the old habits linger. The eyes still search for beauty. The hands still reach. The breath still longs to be more than mechanical. But slowly, gently, the soul learns to let go, not through discipline, but through exhaustion. Desire wears itself down, like waves against stone, until the stone no longer resists. It simply is. This is not enlightenment, not salvation, it is subtraction. A quiet erasure of the unnecessary, the unreal. The self fades, not into oblivion, but into transparency. One sees without coloring, listens without needing to reply, moves without destination. The will continues, but it no longer speaks with the voice of I. It becomes background noise, like wind through dead leaves, still there, but no longer believed. Even time, once the tyrant of the ego, loses its edge. The future no longer lures, the past no longer accuses. All becomes presence cold, undemanding, unpossessed. In this presence, there is no need to become anything. The striving collapses, not in despair, but in peace. The soul sits quietly within the ruins of ambition and watches the dust dance in the light. Love remains, but stripped of hunger. It no longer clings, no longer grasps. It is the love of the leaf falling, of the cloud passing, of the stranger disappearing into the crowd. It asks nothing, promises nothing, expects nothing. It simply recognizes the other as another flicker in the same fire, another echo of the same pain. And in that recognition, there is gentleness, not as virtue, but as the only response left when all illusions have burned away. And what of beauty? Beauty, too, survives, not in objects, but in awareness. The curve of a shadow, the sound of distant rain, the silence between two words, these become sacred, not because they mean something, but because they do not. They are fragments of a world freed from interpretation, allowed to be what they are, without needing to satisfy a hunger that no longer commands. This is the path the world fears. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is honest. It offers no reward, no hope, no identity. It cannot be marketed or measured. It is the path of subtraction, of less and less, until only what is essential remains, and even that is let go. The traveler on this path carries nothing, seeks nothing, clings to nothing, and because of this, he cannot be wounded. He has already died to all that wounds. Even the body, source of so much craving and fear, becomes light in his perception. Not a possession, not a prison, but a temporary appearance. It ages, it sickens, it fades, but it is not his. It is simply part of the flux, like weather, like fire. He does not rage against its loss, for he has already lost the belief that anything could be held. In this, there is not sadness, but a kind of quiet grace. So life continues, indifferent and persistent. The seasons turn, the wars rage. The markets rise and fall. The lovers kiss and part. The world plays its roles with mechanical precision, and the soul detached, disenchanted, but clear, moves through it like a shadow in daylight. It touches without grasping, feels without falling, sees without judging. And finally, there comes a moment not dramatic, not lit by revelation, but simple and unnoticed, where even the observer fades, not into sleep, not into death, but into stillness. The self ceases not because it is destroyed, but because it is no longer needed. What remains is not a person, not a will, not a name, but awareness, vast and indifferent, cradling the world without resistance. There is a silence deeper than mere absence of sound, a silence that lives beneath noise, beneath thought, beneath the frantic insistence of the self. It is not quietude as the mystics describe, nor a meditative hush cultivated by effort. It is the silence that comes when all striving has failed, when even the will's most desperate disguises unravel, and what remains is a hollow space uninhabited by need. In this silence, even language begins to betray itself. Words fall short, because they were always servants of the will, tools fashioned to name and claim and possess. The moment a thing is named, it is placed in relation to desire. It becomes useful, beautiful, threatening, or comforting. But in the cold clarity of detachment, things cease to serve the self. They no longer need to mean, they simply are. A stone, a gust of wind, the cry of a bird, none of it matters. And that is precisely why it is bearable. We mistake meaning for necessity. We believe that to live without meaning is to fall into despair. But this is only true if one still believes that life was ever owed coherence. The child weeps, not because it lacks toys, but because it lacks shelter from chaos. We never lose that weeping entirely. It hides beneath our adulthood, beneath our ambition, our relationships, our philosophies. It emerges in the dead hours of the night, when the masks slip, when the noise fades, when one finally asks, what am I still running from? From ourselves. From the knowledge that nothing can be truly held, not pleasure, not love, not even the self that seeks them. The world turns indifferent to our attachment. The loved one departs. The triumph fades into dust. The body weakens. The mirror grows strange. And we call this tragedy. But it is not tragedy, it is structure. Tragedy requires misfortune, deviation, failure. But this is not failure. This is the rule. The only rule. And so we begin to understand suffering not as something that happens to us, but as the very experience of being a self. The self is a wound that never closes. It aches because it exists. It seeks because it lacks. It clings because it fears its own impermanence. And the world, merciless in its regularity, offers no permanent self. It teases, distracts, delays, but it never cures. The wise do not seek to cure what cannot be healed. They seek to see it, only to see. There is a kind of mercy in this seeing. Not comfort, not joy, but mercy. A soft recognition that one need not add to the fire. One need not intensify the torment by pretending that happiness is just around the corner. One can simply stop. Not by choice, because even choice is another mask of the will, but by exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that leads not to collapse, but to release. And in release, there is no triumph, no applause, no enlightenment, just quiet. The kind that settles over ruins after the battle. The kind that listens, not to understand, but because there is nothing else left to do. This quiet does not offer protection, it offers nothing. That is its gift. A space where nothing is expected, where no one is becoming, where the endless project of selfhood is momentarily abandoned. The body remains, the senses remain, but they are no longer centered. Experience passes through, like wind through an open window. The wind is not grasped, not interpreted. It is felt, and then gone. And the self, no longer obsessed with permanence, allows this passing. It does not chase, it does not cling. It watches the moment die, and feels no need to resuscitate it. Even the past loosens its grip. Memory, once a source of identity and pain, becomes distant, almost fictional. The stories we tell ourselves of who we were, what we overcame, what we lost, become irrelevant. Not false, but unneeded, like dreams that dissolve in daylight. What remains is not narrative, but presence. And presence, unshackled from self-interest, becomes transparent. Nothing is hidden, because nothing needs to be protected. The mind, long a servant of the will, begins to rest. It no longer calculates, no longer defends. It observes, but without urgency. It responds, but without intent to secure advantage. Even fear diminishes, not because one becomes brave, but because one no longer expects survival. Death is not the enemy, because life itself has already been let go. What more can be taken from one who no longer holds? Others may call this apathy, but apathy implies dullness, numbness, the absence of feeling. This is not dullness, it is precision. Feeling remains, but it no longer agitates. Pain still visits, but it does not possess. Joy still flickers, but it does not deceive. Each sensation arises, exists, and falls without commentary. The observer no longer turns experience into identity. He no longer says, "This is mine." He says only, this is. The will, sensing its loosening grip, may lash out. It may flood the mind with temptations, pleasures remembered, futures imagined. It may whisper of legacy, of impact, of one last longing. But these are the cries of a dying king, not commands. The sage hears them, nods, and lets them pass. For he knows that obedience only leads back into the labyrinth of becoming, and he has no desire to become again. To be no one, to belong to nothing, to move without aim, this is not despair. It is the aftermath of despair, its shadow turned into stillness. Not the silence of resignation, but of emancipation. Not a giving up, but a giving over. The world does not need to be resisted. It only needs to be seen, not with the eyes of hunger, but with the vision of detachment. And so one walks, not out of purpose, but because walking happens. One breathes, not out of need, but because air still moves through lungs. One speaks, not to persuade, but to witness. Everything continues, but the fire at the center, the will that once demanded everything, has gone out. And in its absence, there is something the world never promised. Peace, not as reward, but as what remains when wanting ends. When all illusions have fallen like dust from the mind and all veils have lifted from the gaze, what remains is not knowledge, but awareness unadorned, unsought, unclaimed. It does not declare itself. It does not shout of liberation. It sits like a pool of still water in the ruins of longing, reflecting only what is present and permitting it to pass. Even detachment, which once felt like a final freedom, reveals itself as another garment. The self who wore it, who found pride in renunciation, begins to dissolve, not in effort, but in absence. For who is left to be detached, when even the one who watched the will has gone quiet? What once seemed an achievement now lies behind, like the memory of a dream that no longer stirs the heart. And so the world returns not as adversary, not as teacher, but simply as what it always was. Appearances without anchor, change without center. The sky spreads above, not as symbol, but as sky. The earth holds the body, not as mother, not as meaning, but as ground. There is no one to interpret, no one to transform, no one to become. There is only unfolding. Even the question, is there any point, fades in this clarity. It is a question born of the will, searching for purchase in an indifferent universe. But where there is no search, the question becomes silent. There is no point. There never was. And in that stark recognition, something loosens in the chest. What needed purpose was not the world, but the self that suffered within it. Without that self, sorrow does not vanish, but it no longer torments. It falls gently, like mist on the grave, softening the edges of all things. One no longer asks for the pain to cease. One no longer argues with time. One simply breathes, not because breath is valuable, but because it happens. There is no resistance, there is no claim. Others may pass by, still caught in the performance, still striving, still hoping, still building sandcastles against the tide. Their voices rise with hunger, their faces stretch toward futures that will never arrive. And one watches not from superiority, but from stillness. They too will come to this. All must. The will is patient, but the pattern never changes. And when death approaches, it is not met with fear, nor with acceptance. It is not met at all, for there is no one left to meet it. Death enters a room that has already been emptied. The struggle ceased long ago, the fire of desire long extinguished. There is no farewell, no final thought. Only the wind brushing through the hollow where the self once sat. What remains cannot be spoken. It cannot be remembered or passed on. It is not experience, it is cessation. Not an end, but the falling away of beginning and ending alike. No boundary, no form. The last shadow leaves the wall. The last ripple stills, and the water, once stirred by the storm of longing, returns to its mirror. It is here that one finally understands. There was never anything to hold, never anything to become, never anything to fear. The will, the world, the self, all variations of the same trembling illusion. To have seen it is not triumph, it is disappearance. And the light fades, not because the night has come, but because the eyes are no longer needed. There is no return, only the vanishing.